You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your belly ache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Urza Master. With me as always, Lord Uther. And today joining us we have our recurring host, Dirty Harry Callahan. Welcome, welcome.
Punks.
We have friends, crewmates, Starship Explorer, gone to strange new worlds and beyond. But it's time we head back to that which started it all, including that which almost didn't start anything, and that, of course, is the original series, Star Trek, debuting in 1967. Fellas, I can't explain enough, or I suppose I could explain enough, and people will go, okay, you're good. I could explain for days, let's put it that way, just how impactful Star Trek is, how impactful it's been to me. I'm sure you guys have similar stories being sci-fi fans, but this is truly what kind of started it all for space age sci-fi anyway, especially in the television format. And today we're going to be looking at The Cage and The Man Trap. And The Cage, of course, is the unaired pilot, which almost sunk a franchise. But I think we can thank Desilu for keeping it in, shall we say, the loop early on and getting it out there to us for all of us to enjoy in The Man Trap. I won't go too far into the background because I'm going to leave that up to Dirty Harry Callahan, but I do want to say that before we launch into the original series, as we are rehashing material, you'll probably notice that CBS is going to be rehashing Strange New Worlds and potentially eventually Picard on broadcast television. One, because they absolutely listen to the Warp Core Podcast. You can follow us on Pending Rebrand here on YouTube and on all your favorite podcast platforms. But two, because the ongoing strike between the writers and the actors guilds and the moneybags of America, let's just say that we stand in solidarity with their content creator peers. If they want to bring us on into their respective unions, I don't think we'll say no, as long as we get some distribution. But suffice to say, we certainly hope for a fast, resolute, and fair outcome for all parties involved, but especially for the content creators who deserve it. That being said, I will never get tired of going back and rewatching these first two episodes of Star Trek. These are absolutely foundational to really everything we've talked about so far on the Warp Core Podcast and everything that matters to me in the sci-fi universes. You get kind of the best of every world you can imagine in these two episodes. But to give us our typical background and exposition, I'd like to turn it over to Dirty Harry Callahan and his Deadpool of what will happen in these two episodes.
Thank you, Urza Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to you at home. Yes. So back in the day, we had Desilu Productions. We had Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and they ran a very successful television company putting out a show you've probably caught on syndicated reruns or your favorite oldies cable channel, I Love Lucy. And the success of I Love Lucy was so strong that the studios and the network said, hey, what else have you got? And as it turns out, they did want to branch out and move beyond situational comedy. And so they developed and helped finance and produce a science fiction pilot. Now keep in mind, science fiction up until this point was a lot of Ray Harryhausen and stop motion Sinbad-like puppets. It was also Forbidden Planet type, and it was also the classic Red Scare monster movies of the 50s and 60s, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Invaders from Mars, and so on and so forth, War of the Worlds. But this was a chance to for its time, and it's almost inconceivable to think there wasn't a time when science fiction didn't play a huge role in television. This was a time to carve out an hour's space, literally, each week to present far-flung adventures with, at the time, state-of-the-art special effects. I want to interject here at the moment before we go specifically into the cage to kind of piggyback off of Ursa's comments. I was 4 years old when I first saw Star Wars on the big screen, and that profoundly changed my worldview and led me down that path to great science fiction storytelling and everything that it went. I, at the same time, was exposed to Star Trek, which was airing on reruns on various channels. And my 4-year-old self had a hard time reconciling the state-of-the-art George Lucas produced special effects with the somewhat less flashy television effects that were achievable in the late 1960s for television. And as a result, it took me longer to warm up to Star Trek. In fact, it took 3 whole years because in 1979, of course, Paramount launched the big screen franchise with state-of-the-art special effects and a refurbished Enterprise and a very angry cloud that was menacing the Federation. So I eventually got there, but I have to admit that there was a little hesitation initially because I wasn't able to appreciate at such a young age what the storytelling for Star Trek meant in terms of the writing and things that we've discussed in our other podcasts with the more modern shows. And so, like I said, seeing the Enterprise orbiting a world didn't quite have that same punch. I'm delighted to report that in the 50-plus years since these episodes aired, they have gone back and pulled a George Lucas, and they have digitally redone some of those special effects. Now, it may jar, true original purist fans who are used to seeing it, presented a certain way, but it's no longer a barrier or an obstacle to those just wanting to jump in for the first time to see a computerized Enterprise, for example, or an updated Phaser Blast or the like. So, I think anyone joining this series will get a lot out of it that you can see streaming on Paramount Plus. And I think longtime fans also won't feel betrayed. So Desilu, as the production entity, they produced a pilot episode of Star Trek, and it was entitled The Cage, written by the great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry, the series creator and the man who, without this, none would be possible. And The Cage was directed by Robert Butler, who was a veteran TV director at the time, and would go on to do all sorts of different programming in addition to his work on Star Trek. He directed episodes of Hogan's Hero and Adam West's Batman. Later on in his career, he would do the classic Stephen Bochco drama Hill Street Blues. He co-created and directed Remington Steele with Pierce Brosnan, which I was not aware of as I did the research. He also worked on Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd's Moonlighting. And his last recent work, which was several years ago, was working with Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher on Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, which also tried to break some ground, bringing The Man of Steel to a weekly episodic broadcast, well before Smallville.
That was a great show.
And all those other shows, yes. So Robert Butler, a working TV director, not necessarily with his toes always in science fiction, but definitely could stand behind the camera and call action. Anyways, they shot the pilot in late 1964 and turned it into the network, NBC, in February of 1965, and NBC said, nope, we're not putting this on the air. They They said it was too cerebral, too smart for 1960s audiences, and it didn't have enough action because there were a lot of philosophical underpinnings and musings that Roddenberry incorporated. And so usually when that happens, when a network says, no, we're not airing this, that's generally where series go to die. However, Desilu believed in the concept, believed in Roddenberry's vision, and so a second pilot was commissioned, which went with the title Where No Man Has Gone Before, and we'll actually be discussing that probably in our next episode of the Warp Core, as that is now classified as the 4th episode in the run of the original season here of Star Trek. Much of the footage of the cage, now they'd spent money on costumes, actors, special effects, and the like. Much of the footage, they had a very modern solution to it. They repurposed it and incorporated it later in the 2-part Star Trek episode, The Menagerie, which we will also be discussing in a future podcast. So don't change the channel. It's not a rerun. We'll be talking about how they integrated new cast, old cast, and the like when we get there. So this pilot is notable because it is not Captain Kirk and Sulu and Montgomery Scott and the like. It's Captain Christopher Pike, as played by Jeffrey Hunter, doing what I thought was a pre-Ray Liotta in some of his sequences. Now, fans and viewers of the Warp Core know how much we love Chris Pike in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And this is where those creators of Strange New Worlds, when they had the chance to give the franchise a new chapter, they decided to go back to this relationship and this crew, which, again, primarily features Pike, his number one, played by Star Trek longtime legend Majel Barrett, and of course Mr. Spock. Although we're going to discuss very shortly, it's a very different Spock than we're used to seeing and debating. And the vibe that you get when watching this show with fresh eyes, or maybe when you remembered seeing it as a youth and then revisiting and so forth, it has different rhythms. I mean, you can really feel like this was sort of a workshopped concept because, again, they were boldly going where no one has gone before. And the established Star Trek, I don't want to diminish them by calling them tropes, but the established language, the visual language of Star Trek, the way the characters interacted with each other, this is all just embryonic. And there's going to be a lot of forward steps to get us to what we now consider, classic Star Trek, if you will. So on the one hand, you have to keep an open mind when watching it, knowing that, they were trying several different avenues. Not all of them panned out quite the way they expected. But on the other hand, you see the genesis of what would become a cornerstone television show in the market. And I guess I want to start our discussion, gentlemen, with the idea of what is your takeaway moment in rewatching The Cage. What is it that you think that they did great to build upon or expand, or they absolutely nailed it in this episode? And what is your sort of peak cringe, like, I'm glad they abandoned that and went a different direction or modified it, edited it, made it better? So what was your highlight / low light, I guess, looking back on, again, where it all began, and you're like, I'm glad they took that path, and I'm certainly glad they avoided, that one. They definitely took the right fork, and I think Urza can probably speak to it best early, having that lifelong affinity. So what was your high and your low, I guess, from The Cage?
Well, it's tough because I think there's a good mixture of both highlights and lowlights, and you could really pick this one apart. I think the best change they did was replacing Captain Pike. He is definitely the low light of this episode. He comes across as an asshole. I mean, to be perfectly frank, he comes across as kind of misogynist, but also, just sort of he's that classical sort of 50s era position of power, although a little bit more learned, but definitely a representation in the future of somewhat ignorant. But open-minded enough to be a good problem solver. And I think you see a lot of new Pike in old Pike, but new Pike seems to pull the best parts of old Pike out. And so I think with the context of Strange New Worlds, I like Captain Pike more than I used to, but I still find him pretty detestable throughout this episode. I think the highlight of this episode is definitely the performance of Majel Barrett. I think having a female number one, despite Captain Pike having to get used to having a woman on the bridge, although there's one right there.
I'll never get used to it.
I think it's really inspiring to see that kind of groundbreaking moment in television where, the woman in very typical Lucille Ball style had a position of power, was put in a position where she was not just impactful, but sort of the crux of the episode, really. Taking command of the ship, trying, to save Captain Pike, and using all of these, like, very procedural kind of things we see in Star Trek later. Where they're using the ship to try and affect the planet they're on, making very calculated by the book decisions, but also going above and beyond when necessary. I don't know. I just think it's really nice representation. I think it's really nice, true to Gene Roddenberry's vision work.
I thought her performance, I could see Rebecca Romaine delivering a very similar performance, and this is, generations and years across the spectrum. I very easily, whereas I had a little more difficulty imagining Anson Mount playing Pike exactly in this fashion, stretching out on a bed and belittling the yeoman for giving him paperwork. I definitely could close my eyes and I would say, like, this was 85 to 90% of perhaps how our modern number one would have come across, and I thought that was a good job.
Really
on there.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did a really nice job with it. I think those two components, like if I had to pick two quick ones, that would be it. I mean, you could say how they changed the design of the ship, that they switched from paper to sort of tablets to, there's a lot of things going on. The changing of the crew, it just, like you said, this is a very much a work in progress type pilot. As we see with other pilots through the years that don't make it to air, and then they end up changing it all, and you get it as a DVD extra or a bonus segment at the forefront of the collection of episodes on VHS, or whatever they do with Blu-ray and 4K. But it's always really cool to see kind of these opening episodes, and this is probably the most unique that I've ever seen for any show, where so much changed, and yet the core of the show remained so very, very much the same. I will say, having number one not appear on the Man Trap moving forward was actually a tremendous disappointment. But that's why it's my highlight, I guess, is because we don't get her moving forward.
Yeah, so the highlights, the writing, because that's something you definitely see that carries through to the other episodes, right? I almost, maybe that's what helped push it forward, was it was so different. Just the thought process, them diving into some interesting type of sci-fi ideas. So I think that's the piece, right, that allows the series to continue forward. So my low light, something's off with the crew. There's no meshing, right? We've talked about that a lot. Strange New Worlds just comes right out of the gate, and you could just tell everything is in sync. And here, it's it's so disjointed, it's awkward. I mean, it's like cringeworthy that it doesn't pace correctly. A lot of it, in my opinion, a lot of it centers around Pike and it not working that way. Um, and then when you see the first episode with the new crew, with the man trap, something's right, especially between the big three. You could see it right away. Spock, Bones, Kirk, they're all in sync. And my comment to all of that is you can see why they hit the reset button. It's very evident. The potential was there. They couldn't get it to mesh right, so they had to do that hard reset. And it's again very evident in this first episode. Pike was just so off-putting, even for the time period, I'm guessing. And again, I know it's the '60s, whatever. Which something was just off.
All we needed was a cigarette, like just to like he just felt like
Yeah,
he just light up there.
and a bourbon. That's all you needed. Was that.
He's just super unlikable, but
Yes.
he had his moments though. I mean, despite being that unlikable, there was some rays behind there where it was like he almost kind of knew that he was kind of being a jerk, and you could kind of see it play out just a little bit, especially at like the end of the episode, where he kind of like sort of realizes his place a little bit. But I mean, I understand like he has to play up the aggression part to break free of the cage, right? He has to block his thoughts by using simple emotions. The problem is he plays his character that way the entire episode. He just comes across as just a turd. And I mean, I got to be honest, like if that's the way they wanted to take the ship's captain, it was successful, but it would have driven the show right into the ground.
So I have a bunch of I made little notes, little bullet points, and I'm just going to shoot them out there, and you guys rapid fire can agree, disagree, react. We cannot overlook whatever notes Leonard Nimoy got between this pilot and the man trap and where no man has gone before. This was a very heavily caffeinated Spock, and it's jarring to see him shouting out like the screens are down, nothing's working. And later on in the episode, he's like willing to abandon the Pike, and everyone's like, we've got to get out of here, flee. And it's so un-Spock like as how we are brought up to think of Spock. And I think, like I said, he hadn't found the character yet, and whoever took him aside and said, let's slow this down a little. Let's make it more of a simmer. But if you delight in and this wasn't Spock's been infected with the intergalactic virus and has gone embraced his human side. None of that duality appears to be present unless I really missed it. He's just a guy with funny makeup. He's just another member of the crew, and I think an excellent choice to try and divert away from that, because that was just that was a little head scratching to be frank. Did you guys pick up on the?
And that's that's the beauty of the big three's relationship. Kirk looks to Spock. That's the great evolution, right? When Spock becomes pure logic in that sense. So that's Kirk's logical side, and I'm gonna think through this. And then McCoy is always the emotion. So when the three of them are together, he gets those two pieces, right? Because I think this goes with anything in life. And Urza and I have talked a lot about leadership and just working with your employees and overseeing people, or me working with kids, right? There are moments that you go with your gut, whether you're going to say something or act a certain way, times that you're going to seize a moment, and then there's times where you've got to be very methodical in what you do. And that's the thing that we love about Kirk. He always will gather them together. Think about in Wrath of Khan when they go to watch the video on Genesis, right? And Spock's talking the logical piece, and McCoy's like, we're talking about Universal Armageddon, right? That's the emotional piece, and that's the beauty of it. And it even makes me ponder. Going back and watching those episodes, I think it's almost pivotal that he becomes emotionless. Is it even and it's tough for me to come to this conclusion because, we're looking at the 1960s here. Was him being logical completely different during that time period of that pure logic, and is that part of the essence or the hook that really brings people in?
Yeah,
That,
I mean,
there's my thought.
I think you nailed it there. Fundamentally, I think from a just a period piece perspective, I think Spock was the foil that Roddenberry felt the world needed. The pure logic of things. A leads to Z, basically. He was the one who would point out that this is where conflict escalates, and this is why we need to choose a different path, or this is why we do need to opt for violence. I think that was the beauty of Spock, and I think it just got missed in the cage. And I'm sure Roddenberry had notes because he saw probably the flashes of the Spock we see, because there are brief moments just with wording and characterization that Spock comes across a little bit more like Spock. But by and large, yeah, it's really jarring because I saw the cage. Boy, I mean, I think the first time I saw it, because I don't think it was the Menagerie, because I think it took me years because it was in syndication when I first saw the original series. I probably saw the Menagerie for the first time as like a mid-20s adult. I'd seen a lot of Star Trek, but I don't think I'd actually seen those two episodes. And I think The Cage was something I saw pretty late in life. So, like, I'd seen all the movies. I'd seen Spock's, evolution from pure logic to this, sage-like balance of a character we get in Next Generation and the movies. So seeing this Spock was just like, that's not Spock. I don't know what that is. But I do think it's Leonard Nimoy.
Yes.
And it brings me to, why he was so adamant, I am not Spock. Because he's far more an emotional human being. And I think the beauty of Spock becoming who Spock becomes really transformed him as an actor and as a person. And I think you get that in his life story, which, all the Spock documentaries do such a beautiful job of getting into, is like, not only was this character completely changed for the series, it completely changed Leonard Nimoy as a person. For the better, I think. I think that's why later in life you see him, able to rebuild his family and all that stuff that a lot of actors and rock stars and things, they lose that because of XYZ fanhood or just being famous. And so I think Spock continues to teach lessons from the cage on out, which is kind of amazing. I mean, really, and that's why I think what we do get with Spock is so revered and so important. It's not just the logic, it's not just the period piece that we're looking at the original series with, or how Vulcans become like this elf-like culture in Star Trek as a whole. It's really just the transformative nature of Roddenberry's vision, made manifest, that has transformed our lives. It's transformed our culture. Worldwide, I think humanity is different because of this character, which I don't think is an overstatement. I mean, I really don't. I think between how media has changed, television has changed, now people now sort of elevate science to a much more important level. I mean, I think of people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a sort of a plucky guy, but also a vaunted scientist. He's a lot like the playful side of Spock, who kind of likes to rib McCoy, and you get, sort of the vice versa from, like a guy like Joe Rogan. And you see those two on the podcast together. They're kind of, ribbing each other back and forth with a little logic, a little emotion. It's Kirk and Spock in a way. Now, I'm not drawing exact comparisons, so I hope nobody gets too upset by this. But, I think we see that play out a lot in the culture. So it's really amazing to think that at one point, this Spock that has changed the world almost was just another dude. That's pretty cool.
Yep.
I love that you two picked up on the idea that in a very turbulent decade, civil unrest and change, the assassination of Kennedy, the civil rights movement, Vietnam, all of it, that a character presented in the mainstream could almost be considered counterculture with his cool, unassailable logic, which, as you both point out, could have been like a refreshing balm for people who felt like every time they turned on the evening news or read the local paper that everything was going to hell in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we weren't there, but again, we've certainly seen the Oliver Stone films, so we get a good idea that it was a time of unrest and tumult, and Spock would be a nice counterbalance to that, to make people say, see, just connect the dots, A to Z, and there you have it. All right, some other real quick notes that I made. The one thing I didn't like about Robert Butler's direction, did you notice there was a lot of glancing between cast members? Pike would look over here, and then number one would look over there, and then back, and again, it's all about the rhythms of TV and so forth at the time. But there was an inordinate amount of glancing that I noted. I liked with Pike second guessing his career moves, because again, we see that in the modern Anson Mount iteration of Pike. So everything that we've said about him up till now is true, but I can see where the writers, Henry Alonzo Myers, has looked back and said, yeah, we can get that sort of, I'm not sure if this is really where I want to be, kind of hesitation, and subtly worked it in with Anson and his interpretation. We had faxes in space well before they were an office staple in the 90s. We also had desk lamps, and that was a little weird. The consoles, I'm not so sure if they needed extra illumination or not, but I'm glad they ditched the banker's lamps. The warp speed sequence, which is mercifully brief, is also silly, even for the 60s standards. Just kind of, we'll keep the camera on the crew, and then we'll put in a star field and just sort of blend and yeah, no. I'm glad that was cut out there. I didn't see any red shirts in the landing party. They were all blue. And my favorite sequence reminds me of one of my favorite rides at Disneyland, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. We do get a brief sequence of Chris Pike in hell, which I'm sure was, edgier seat stuff back in the mid 60s, but I enjoyed this sort of wild, surround him with fire, brimstone, and stalactites. And, I loved Pike in hell. I wrote down a question mark, like, really? So those were some of the clicks that I have. I think we can all agree that, it's a necessary part to understand the full picture of Star Trek. But I think we're all going to be very pleased as we shift our attentions here to the man trap in some of the creative casting and choices that they made. So with that, the backstory of the man trap, which was the first actual, I believe, aired episode of Star Trek. The second pilot, as we said, actually shows up early in the season, and television seasons were even crazier than they are now back then. The first season of the original series was 30 episodes, which would be a lot even for network TV. Most dramatic series, by when we were growing up and watching things like Magnum PI and Simon and Simon and the like, most network orders were around 22. So this was like another 8 episodes, another third of a season or fourth of a season tacked on to that. So there's a lot. And this wasn't a half-hour situational comedy like I Love Lucy. This is a drama series, with all the appropriate trappings and the like. So you got your money's worth, or they got their budget's worth for this first season and subsequent seasons. The Man Trap was written by George Clayton Johnson, and he was one of the co-writers of the novel that would inspire Logan's Run, which is a Farrah Fawcett. If you haven't caught that yet, that's an interesting one there. He also worked on some Twilight Zone episodes, and he wrote the original story and screenplay for Ocean's 11, the Rat Pack version, which George Clooney and Brad Pitt would later update in the 2000s. So I think the thing we should remind ourselves with was that writing room and writing teams and so forth back in the 60s, they weren't necessarily as we might imagine them today. In any case, a lot of the people who worked on Star Trek, as we go through there, they also had successful careers elsewhere and in other genres and other fields, novelists and playwrights and the like. But oftentimes it would be Gene Roddenberry walking by somebody on the lot and saying, "Hey, you want to write an episode? Hey, come do that." It was more of a gig job back then rather than the highly in sync writing teams that we've seen for Picard and Strange New Worlds and so forth. So there's a lot of, the very quality of the episodes will rise and fall depending on who happened to be working on it this week. And that goes with the director, Mark Daniels, who went on to do 15 episodes of Star Trek in his career, but he worked for Desilu, which is how he got this gig to do The Man Trap. So he was directing their shows. He did 38 episodes of I Love Lucy. He also worked on Gunsmoke, Mission Impossible, the television show, Hogan's Heroes again. There's a lot of Hogan's Heroes Star Trek connections if you really want to delve deep there. And even in Fame. And, those kids are going to live forever, especially that Coco. But he was, and he also wrote one of the animated episodes in Urza Master's favorite animated series of Star Trek, One of Our Planets is Missing. So Mark Daniels, he has that, there it is. He had a lot of Trek under his belt, but he was not like a science fiction guy. He was a television guy, and he went wherever the paychecks led him. And so those are the two creative minds. The Man Trap first aired on September 8th, 1966. That's 57 years, if you're good with math. And this, I will say right away to sort of launch, and you guys can do your best impressions in a moment. I get it now in just one episode. And I remember I've seen the movies and I've, doing whatever. I get the Shatner experience from this episode alone. There is such a cool, suave persona that's neither over or underplayed. And, some people have critiqued him over the years of, being a ham or being too much into it. But when he comes on the screen in The Man Trap, and this will be blasphemy to you two, I felt like I did when I saw Chris Pine in the first Kelvin Star Trek. I couldn't take my eyes off of William Shatner. I just couldn't. Like I wanted to spend every moment of that episode, The Man Trap, like just if he could have read the phone book. There was just this natural charisma in his youth and vigor that I assume that it will, continue to evolve as we go through the show. But I absolutely get it. And we're talking about how the cast of Strange New Worlds, kind of gelled right away. I get Captain Kirk. Like he told me everything I needed to know and enjoy. And much like Kyle MacLachlan, from his first moments in the pilot of Twin Peaks, like he just became like the water cooler moment, the buzz of the show. And now we haven't even gotten to a reconfigured Spock and then the addition of Leonard Bones McCoy. And I absolutely love DeForest Kelley because I see this performance in 1966 as consistent and as charming as I did in The Final Frontier, in the late 80s. Like it feels like these three, the big three, as Lord Uther calls them, like they understood their characters right from the jump, and there wasn't sort of a casting about who am I, what does all this mean, and you guys can speak more to that. But I was shocked at how familiar it was, even though it was unfamiliar. Like I was shocked at like how easily I accept. I'm like, oh, those are those guys from Star Trek 2 and all the movies I saw as a kid. Like it's there, and it just so So, anyways, I throw it out to how you guys felt about the new and improved crew of the Enterprise in an episode that, quite frankly, it's got a little bit of horror in it. This idea of this
Mystery.
creepy monster. It's got phaser battles and explosion. Like it's if NBC said make it more actiony. I mean, this was like the Joel Silver produced. You know, like there's quite a bit of bang for your buck. Given again what we had seen in the cage and so forth there. This one I can see audiences. Did you see that last night? And of course, there was no streaming or things like that. So if they didn't, they'd be like, I missed it. And then, but anyways, let's go with it. What do you guys think of the man trap and that salt sucking creature?
I'm even gonna. Sorry, Urza. I
No,
always
take
let
it
you go
away.
first. My bad.
You're good.
I'm gonna compare it to the first season of Next Generation, and here's why. Everyone knew their place. I feel like in the man trap, it was very evident, right? And with Next Gen, because I was saying the other day how on Pluto TV they're playing all the DS9 episodes, and they'll go between Next Gen and TOS episodes. And so I'm watching some of these earlier episodes of Next Gen. They didn't know what to do with Worf. They weren't sure what to do with LaForge. They were trying to figure out where everyone's supposed to be. And I feel like right off the bat, very similar to Strange New Worlds, which is the reason why we love it so much, everyone knew their role. And especially when you're coming off of, the original pilot that was completely different in a sense. All these guys knew what they were supposed to be doing. You get a very veteran, and if I remember correctly, well-known DeForest Kelley, who had done a lot of westerns, and I think kind of had that calm, cool side to him in a sense. And Shatner, like, we get all phases of Shatner in this one. We get him doing, like, at the end, we get a Wrath of Khan moment almost, where he's like, when the salt thing is like, and then he falls down and he slumps forward. All that Shatner cheesy Canadian acting that he's got going on, like, it was just so great to see him in that role. Again, very manly in that role. He was a good-looking guy for the time too. I mean,
Yeah,
you could see why people were swooning over him, right?
right.
So all those great things, and I'm going to agree with Urza now that I really kind of thought about it since his original comment. Number one, not being there with Barrett, I think I would have loved to have seen that dynamic with Kirk. It would have been very interesting. But like we have Uhura right off the bat, who's on the bridge. We've got Sulu. I think we're still missing
As a
Scotty at
botanist.
this point.
We
As
cannot
what?
overlook as a
Yes,
botanist.
great
They-
point. Yep.
so-
And that little plant that was really someone's hand, which I thought was great as well. And then we get some mystery here with how it changes shapes and forms. The salt monster, just a cool sci-fi idea. You can, again, I know I keep saying, you can see how it got a hold of sci-fi people and how it took off. It's just good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, yes, to steal Lord Utherism. I mean, yeah, we got a full spectrum of Shatner, who, of course, had been on the Twilight Zone, and we all remember him from Something on the Wing. Something! And, I love how people, over the years have, like, parodied him of overacting, but you had to, right? You had to sell these moments that were so unreal at the time. And yeah, 10 years later, when a lot of people who in the 80s and 90s made fun of Shatner as Kirk, even carrying through to today, it did seem cheesy. But at the time, this was real. I mean, this was like, that was a way to sell the show. And even to this day, Shatner has a commanding presence on screen. Even if he could be reading you a recipe for, brownies off of a box, and you're captivated. Yeah, absolutely. A good-looking guy, swagger, class, charm, but but also sort of a steely, hardened captain's attitude, right? He's unafraid, but he's also cautious and calculating and charismatic and diplomatic in ways that I don't think, especially for the time, you weren't seeing out of quote unquote leaders in the world. You were seeing a lot of mudflinging or obfuscation, a lot of criticism of leaders for being dishonest or weak. You kind of got all of this, and here is this sort of paragon of everything you want in a leader on a starship in the future. Kind of a reassuring thing, right? Everybody's like, okay, we're in good hands. And then you do get the gel of the crew. The Spock, McCoy, which will of course only grow to be just a wonderful thing. But that triumvirate is what really kind of, I think, a number one not being on the show is as disappointing as it is. It wouldn't have worked because it would have compromised that situation. And I do think later shows figured it out, like Next Generation with Riker and how they balanced out a larger crew, where most of the original series episodes really feature on the big three. You get some Sulu episodes, you get some Uhura, you get some Scotty, and of course later on you get some Walter Koenig episodes, but for the most part, this whole series is about those three, and obviously that's why the subsequent 6 movies, which we've talked about, really focus heavily on their relationships and the twos and fros therein. And it's cinematic magic. Even though it's small screen at the time, it is really that. It's not just the writing. Like, the writers did a fine job. The directors, you can definitely tell it's a director of the week. But the way they did that invented how you tell Star Trek stories. They basically invented this process by which we consume Star Trek today with the exploration type episodes that you don't know what you're going to get. You might get a writer who really doesn't know Star Trek but can tell a great story about an alien planet. A very Ray Bradbury approach to telling sci-fi. It's always a little different, but it's rooted in some kind of concrete, today type story, which, for those out there who complain that new Star Trek is too woke, I'm sorry. If you know anything about your history and you watch the original series, it's always been social commentary. It's just told in such a compelling way that doesn't beat you over the head. And I do agree that when a show beats you over the head with their message, it's annoying. Whether you agree with that message or not, it's always annoying. The beautiful thing about Star Trek is it's very often not beating you over the head with whatever it's trying to tell you. First episode of Strange New Worlds, maybe a little bit, but the original series was very tactfully painting these pictures, which was not lost on audiences. They knew what they were doing, but it was told in such an entertaining manner that it didn't feel like this political diatribe that was exhausting during the Vietnam War. Like, it just took it out of you. The whole country needed an escape. This was a way to talk about the problems of today and the hopes for tomorrow without bumming people out. It gave you a way to talk about things in a hopeful, delightful manner. And really, I think the beauty of what we see in The Man Trap is it also played up all of the cheeky television stuff, like the sexual intrigue, the sort of male struggle over the female, the idea of horror, without being too scary, but just exciting enough and thrilling enough to be compelling. And that really becomes, for future episodes of Star Trek, all series, including this one, really becomes just the norm. And I think that's what all other television shows of this nature and not sci-fi reach for. They want to deliver this kind of non-formulaic but formulaic punch that gets you right where it feels good and also right where it feels bad and leaves you wanting more. and I think the Man Trap does that. If nothing else, I ended that episode wanting more. I'm like, I can't wait to roll to the next episode. Whether I have to switch the VHS tape or, hit the arrow button on the DVD or skip the streaming, like, it's really just impeccable television. I mean, even in the context of the time, it's just an incredible. I mean, you can see where this became an instant classic, and you know, we'll get into later episodes and why the series only ran for 3 seasons. But you can definitely tell, like, this wasn't going away, even if it only lasted a single season. This was in the ears and minds of generations of writers to come.
My notes on this episode include, but are not limited to, McCoy's cute nickname Plum and how Kirk likes to tease him on that. I wrote down impish Shatner grin, and I think he takes over very early when the settlers, they're like, we don't want you here, get off, get off our planet. And he's very firm, like, no, we're going to test you, and you're going to follow Federation protocol. There's just like, there's steel in his spine. In these new high def rebroadcasts on the streaming, everyone is very sweaty in this episode. Lots of beating on
So true.
DeForest Kelly and Shatner and the like. I mean, Nimoy is cool, calm, and collected like a cucumber, but a lot of people have, I'm like thinking to themselves, wow, I mean, their pores are really sharp. Possibly the first, in fact, it is definitely the first utterance of the classic phrase, he's dead, Jim, with McCoy there. Also, a very tense, like, mom and dad are fighting moment when Kirk yells at McCoy to basically, get his head out of his rear concerning, a relationship with, this shape-shifting vampire. Also a nice brief touch, again, pure horror science fiction, that nobody sees the character the same way, and how they were able to communicate that, without ILM effects or something, just different makeup and different things. But I thought that was very clever. We don't have a sick bay. We have a dispensary in early jargon. They haven't settled yet on get him to sick bay, but there's, Jim, meet me in the dispensary, which sounds like a CVS where you're going to, get a prescription refilled, but they'll land on it soon enough. And then I wrote Uhura Spock. So there must have been a little bit of that, flirting, I believe, as I recall. She was on the bridge and he was on the bridge in this one. And, ask me a question, think of me as, she was doing a little flirting with our favorite Vulcan. And while he wasn't like rejecting her out of hand, he responded as only Spock could. So those were my notes on, again, just a great standalone hour of television with all the bells and whistles. And, you could, if someone said, hey, what is Star Trek? Where do I begin? Just put on the Man Trap and say, either you're going to get it or, go back to, Farscape or whatever it is that you're into there. But this is the episode that does it there for me. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think if anybody has never, well, I think of my kids, right? Like, if I'm going to introduce them to Star Trek, the Man Trap is the episode. I mean, either that or Encounter at Farpoint, because,
Sure.
next gen kid, got to pass it on, right? But Uther brought up a really good point earlier about comparing this to next gen, and I think about this episode comparing it with Farpoint. And even though, knowing what we know now about the next gen crew, like, even though everybody feels kind of out of place, and like a number one would have been on the original series, I think Tasha Yar has a lot of reason why the crew wasn't quite in sync yet, which I really truly believe is why they killed her character off, because it does bring the crew together on that show. Fight me. But you can tell, like, that's the hook. That's where they want to get you. And whether it's Roddenberry trying to capture his audience or tell his story, or any Star Trek writer, producer going forward, that's the moment you want to have. It's not just the man trap for obvious reasons. It's the man trap trying to trap man or humanity into watching this show and setting up a cultural shift. But I could gush about this episode all day, but I think it's time, as we do here on the Warp Core, to give our ratings of both the Cage and the Man Trap. And I do think they need to be rated separately, because this is quite the dichotomy between the two launches of a series, and warranted the discussion to compare the two. So I think we'll kick it off with Lord Uther today. What did you feel for the Cage and the Man Trap?
I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go 4 out of 7 on the Man Trap. Too disjointed. Not a fan of
The Cage, you
of
mean?
Pike.
The Cage,
Or, I'm
right?
sorry, the Cage. The Cage. Sorry.
Uh,
My bad. You're right there, Callahan. Yes. So 4 out of 7 on the Cage. Just like I said, disjointed, etc., etc. But the potential was there. And then the Man Trap. Ooh, I'm gonna go 5.5 out of 7. You can see that cohesiveness. They've hooked me, and they're gonna start reeling me in. We're so spoiled by Strange New Worlds. It's gonna take a lot for episodes, TOS or even TNG, to get that 7 out of 7. I feel like I can think of a TOS episode right off the top of my head that's going to get a 7 out of 7, but 5.5 I think is worth it, because or is worthy of it, as it really sets the table very well for future episodes and for the series. You can see how it's going to last 20-30 years with that crew. I'll send it to Urza.
Ooh, we're switching it up. I like it. All right,
Yes.
We'll finish up with Dirty Harry. I'm going to give the Man Trap a 3 out of 7, which is, I think, my lowest Star Trek rating to date. Me, ever the optimist, I have to be honest when it comes to the Man Trap, or excuse me, the Cage. I love it for what it is, but there's a lot I don't love about it. And it centers on Captain Pike. And ultimately, I think every Star Trek series, it falls to the captain. Like, the show's about the captain at some point or another. No matter what stories you're telling, the captain plays, up until Strange New Worlds, a very integral role. And that's what I think is so brave about SNW, is that there is a lot of storytelling without Captain Pike. And I love that. But Pike in this episode is so unlikable. I really enjoy the way they're setting up the Adam and Eve story, but it is very cerebral. And as much as I appreciate it from a writing perspective and a storytelling perspective, and the fact that it helps lay the foundation for Star Trek forever, it's an unsuccessful episode to me. I think the mercifully short warp scene is mercifully not short enough. I love the camera work, though, for what it is. I think it helped establish a lot of what we do see on the bridge in the future episodes. But again, it seems to me like not just a work in progress, but sort of like a B-reel. Like, oh, here's an idea I had that we could maybe use in the future. I know it's like a film student type TV pilot. No offense to anyone involved. I did enjoy it. But I think in the context of, even at the time, standalone, it just didn't do it for me. Now, the Man Trap, as a contrast, I will give a 5 out of 7. I think that was way more successful. I think it had some hiccups. It didn't quite deliver enough of the trio Spock, Bones, and Kirk as we should get. However, I think we get enough of Kirk and Bones to really flesh out the future of the series in a pilot episode. And I do love the effects that they used. I love the storytelling. I mean, everything about this episode really defined Star Trek. Now, is it the best episode? No. But it does give you everything you need to know about every Star Trek show or movie going forward. And it does it with a really nice style. I think the one thing it may lack is a ship-to-ship confrontation that takes center stage, but that wasn't necessary on this episode. And I think that's where some Star Trek series have emphasized the ship-to-ship stuff a little too much, and they don't focus enough on the exploration part, but 5 out of 7 feels appropriate.
All right, well, I had my cream of wheat this morning, so I'm a little higher on the Cage. I'm with Lord Uther. That's a 4 for all the reasons we've discussed. And I think I'm going to go 5 on Mantrap as well, leaving open the possibility that there could be some truly transcendent episodes down the road. I don't want to encroach on those just yet, but I don't think the 5 I don't want it to sound like it's in some way dismissive. I mean, this truly is a representational episode of this series and would stand alone in any season, even if it was a middle of the 3rd season. You'd say, yeah, that was a good one. But I'll leave open the possibility that we might see some 6s or 7s, reaching forward. So we'll go 4 on the almost pilot, and we'll go 5 for the first aired episode.
Wonderful. Well, we've set the stage, I think, for not just the future of Star Trek, the original series, but the future of the Warp Core podcast. We are on episode 29. Episode 30, which is a milestone for the show, will be next week, and we will be continuing our dive into Star Trek TOS, not them old scientists, but the original series. And I look forward to it. I think we've all been chatty Cathys about Spock, Kirk, McCoy long enough where we finally get to bring out the originals and enjoy them in their best era, perhaps. With that, as always, we do stand with our SAG-AFTRA friends and our Writers Guild of America friends in their struggles for fair compensation. But we also stand bravely, baldly, and graying into the final frontier. Live long and prosper.